Pop quiz. How many brushes did it take to paint this watercolor of mountains by the ocean? Can you guess? 2. Just 2. Brush number 1, a $1.48 chip brush from Lowe's. Brush number 2, a Princeton Neptune Quill for $27. So how did these unlikely partners create something beautiful? Let's dive in and I'll show you. Inspired by my travels to Whidbey Island, this scene is actually completely made up, but it's based on the footage that you see here. The watercolor paper I'm using is Fabriano cold pressed, 140 pounds. I've got it taped to a Gator board. The first step is to lay down some clean water onto the paper, and this is where I'm going to build up my clouds, and I'm going to leave hard edges to suggest mountaintops. For the sky color, I'm using Cobalt blue and a little bit of Manganese blue hue, plus a little bit of burnt sienna to give it just a little bit of a grayish color. I've mixed up a custom gray for the distant mountains made of Winsor violet, Indanthrone blue, and burnt sienna. Notice that the trick is that I leave dry paper in between the bottoms of the clouds and the tops of the mountain peaks, all this time working wet into wet. As the mountain ranges get closer to the viewer, I'm adding in shadow green to that gray mixture. As the mountains get closer yet, I'm adding in undersea green. The warmer the colors are, the closer they look to the viewer. Another thing I'm doing is to leave white gaps on the paper. And later on, what I'll do is I will convert those little white parallelograms into what looks like some kind of buildings. For the mountains on the right-hand side, notice how the green is bleeding up into the distant mountains, and that suggests distant trees. I really like that. The reason it happened is that the mountains that are in the foreground are wetter than the mountains in the distance. Now, the mountains in the distance look matte. It doesn't look shiny. It doesn't look wet, but it actually is a little bit damp, and that's how you get that bleeding effect. For the water, I've started to add in some cobalt blue, a little bit of indanthrone blue into that green, so I'm still using some of the green in the color, but not expressly so. Because I'm working wet into wet, the green of the mountains is bleeding into the water, which is going to help do two things. One, it's going to help create a sense of reflections. And number 2, it's going to help pull the color of the mountains elsewhere into the painting, thus giving it unity. Reflections in water are almost always darker than the actual objects themselves. So that's why I'm trying to use a darker green to show the reflections of the mountains that are actually closer to the viewer. To make the mountains darker yet, I've mixed up some more of the gray and added into the shadow green. Using that special grayish purple that I described earlier, now I'm bringing in the reflections of the distant mountains into the water. Now I'm preparing for the foreground foliage, and this chip brush is just fabulous for that. As you can see, it creates wispy effects that can be interpreted as foliage or sticks and stems. Now, let me explain the color just a little bit. I visit Whidbey Island in August, and it tends to be dry in Washington State in the summer months, and so it's just dry everywhere. In fact, the first time I went, I was a little bit shocked because people I had spoken to over the years about the Pacific Northwest was that it was so lush and green and there are rainforests, so I didn't expect that the first time. No, as I was doing it, I thought, I think I'd like to actually bring in some green into the foliage, even though the foliage is generally dead when you're there. And I don't mean the trees and the flowers. I mean just, the grasses and, the grasses in your lawn, the grasses at the side of the road, the grasses on the bluffs over the ocean. So you can see here that I'm using green gold, some undersea green, some shadow green, just to get some depth. I'm also using some of that special gray that I was talking about, and that will suggest shadow in the grasses. If you notice, I have put in a little tiny bit of pure Winsor violet in places, and I love how it blends with shadow green and other greens to give a shadow effect that is sort of, I don't know, emotional. It's a really pretty combination. So now I'm diving in for a close-up so you can see what the painting looks like at this point. It has dried, and I am going to go back and do a few more things. As you saw, I left some gaps on the top of the water to suggest a wave action, but I felt like those gaps were just too white and too stark. So I did a unifying wash over the painting to get those to blend in. The way to do a unifying wash is just to brush clean water over the areas of the painting where you want it, and it'll pick up a little bit of the pigment, and you can see that's what's happened, that those parallelograms on top of the water are not nearly as stark. The other thing to notice is that on the left, I've put a little bit of shadow on the little tiny parallelograms to make them look like buildings. Is this painting finished? Is there more you could do to it, such as putting in a pleasure boat or perhaps a Washington State ferry? Yeah, I'll leave that up to you. If you were doing this painting, what would you like to do next? You can tell me in the comments.